Welcome to the CDA Institute's Expert Series, the podcast that brings you critical discussions with thought leaders in defense, security, and global affairs. My name is Gabriella Picton, and I am this episode's host. The CDA Institute encourages rigorous debate on national security matters through our events, research, and publications. In today's episode, we are joined by Behnam Ben Taleblu, Senior Research Fellow at the Foundation for the Defence of Democracies, Thomas Juneau, Assistant Professor at the University of Ottawa's Graduate School of Public and International Affairs, and Peter Jones, Executive Director of the Ottawa Dialogue at the University of Ottawa, to discuss recent escalations in the Middle East. Highlighting the danger of a full-scale regional war erupting, this episode touches on topics ranging from Israeli and Iranian domestic politics to their impact in shaping broader regional security dynamics. This is the Expert Series. Could you begin by giving your assessment of how new President Mossad Pezeshkian's administration may mark a shift in relations with the rest of the region?
Sure. So actually, I think Pezeshkian was promoted because he had something of a mandate, not a mandate by the people, but actually I would say a mandate by the system itself. I think the system realized it was in trouble, and you can draw a sharp contrast with the previous administration in the Islamic Republic and the things that were happening to Iran and how the Islamic Republic may be trying to stylistically dig itself out of a foxhole, not substantively. I think, unfortunately, the big trend lines that we have about the corruption in the country, the human rights abuses in the country, the jailings in the country, you've seen already a spike in executions since Pezeshkian was even elected. Those trend lines are likely to continue. And the same thing with respect to outside of Iran, with respect to the region, the involvement of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the weapons proliferation to the myriad proxies, the tightening of the ties with the likes of Russia and China. In fact, Pezeshkian will recall those two countries strategic partners or strategic allies of the Islamic Republic. And he's basically heaped praise onto every single terrorist group that exists in the axis of resistance. That includes the recently killed Ismail Haniyeh, the political chief of Hamas. But nonetheless, there is a difference in style that Pezeshkian is trying to elicit that is quite similar to the difference in style that former President Rouhani in 2013 to 17 and 17 to 21 tried to elicit. And that stylistic change allows for engagement with the West, allows for the base-saving line of retreat for the West to engage in limited nuclear diplomacy, to engage in some level of marginal sanctions relief, and to be able to get the Islamic Republic to kick the can down the road with respect to its nuclear program, not give anything up, but put things in storage, put things away. With respect to the region, what happened during the previous administration is that actually the Raisi government was able to break some taboos that existed, rebuild diplomatic ties with, pro-American states, countries like Saudi Arabia, for example. There is a line from the founding father of the Islamic Republic, Ayatollah Khomeini, that basically says, I think it was late in the Iran-Iraq War when he said this, he said that, paraphrasing, but he said, if you forget about the Americans, if you forget about the issue of Palestine, if you forgive Saddam, we will never forgive the Al-Saud. So this is the level of ideational enmity that exists between Tehran and Riyadh. And it's largely dominated the politics of national security policy during previous periods when you've had a reformist president at the helm, and the type of ties that they have tried to build. They've been limited because of this ideational and strategic enmity. But the Islamic Republic has been trying to rope-a-dope American partners. And this is consistent with that larger trend of trying to elicit a stylistic change. With respect to Saudi Arabia, it was about 10 years of a shiv in the back, and now 1 or 2 years of a handshake up front. That 10 years was the Houthis and the arms proliferation, and now it's essentially the diplomatic normalization. And Saudi Arabia does have something to show for it. They'll say, look, we have not been attacked since the Houthis started firing after October 7th. But this is really, I would say, akin to extortion. And that's what the regime is trying to get the pro-American Arab order to do in the region. It's trying to get them to kind of be cowed and humbled and essentially give deference to Iran, not become a mini Islamic Republic overnight, but give deference to Iran. And this is a much larger foreign and security policy direction that is set by the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the Supreme Leader and his office, and even the Supreme National Security Council. So the desire to engage in these kind of limited diplomatic normalizations. You've seen stories about potentially with Bahrain coming up. There are also actually expanding diplomatic ties with Azerbaijan. That's historic as well. In the past, you've had potentially Egypt and Morocco. So these are different approaches by the Islamic Republic. So long story short, Pezeshkian is likely to continue that trend while actually keeping the Islamic Republic on the same kind of rhetorical footing vis-a-vis Israel and the Palestinians. So I would say, again, long story short, stylistic change, not substantive change.
Okay, fantastic. Well, thank you so much for that very in-depth analysis. And I hope we can continue that line to look more at Iran's internal politics and how they may be affecting external relations. Who are the hawks within Iran's domestic political landscape that may seek to worsen the current regional crisis? And what external groups or actors might they ally themselves with to do so?
Well, in essence, I think the left-right paradigm is not always the best one. In fact, even some of these terms are highly relational and relative, like moderate or reformist or things of that nature. If you are looking at the Pezeshkian administration, he's trying to get as we speak now, he's trying to get his cabinet approved by a parliament. I would say this is an instance of where personnel is not necessarily policy, because those individuals filling those cabinet positions are not going to be driving the big things that we care about here in the West, in North America, in Europe. What's largely going to be driving those issues, the nuclear program, the missile program, the drone program, are actually several institutions. And one of the legacies of the current Supreme Leader of Iran, who is I would say, the longest running contemporary dictator in the Middle East, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, is that despite casting a sharp contrast with his predecessor, Ayatollah Khomeini, who was the founder of the state and had this kind of charismatic authority, Khamenei doesn't have that. And while, yes, many experts and scholars have said that when he was supreme leader, because he didn't have a natural constituency, he tied himself to the military, which is true, and that's how the IRGC entered politics and the economy. But also what Khamenei has done is also institutionalize elements that would ultimately come to be loyal to him. And while traditionally a lot of Iran experts and scholars and academics look to these different electoral periods to see how the Iranian people would try to inch things along, what the regime has also done during these rounds of elections, or shall we say selections, is to tighten off the system, is to use these contests to limit the already very limited political space in Iran, such that today an institution like the Guardian Council is beholden to the Supreme Leader. An institution like the Assembly of Experts is beholden to the Supreme Leader. While the Supreme Leader doesn't sit on the Supreme National Security Council, he does influence it indirectly. So there's lots of institutions that will represent the views, values, and wishes of the man at the top. But lest we think that this is just a one-way street where Khamenei has to give orders, he really ultimately has veto authority. And what he's done is promote a whole series of hardliners across a whole host of political, religious, and military institutions that can intonate what he wants without him having to say it. And you'll likely only hear from him if you do something wrong or if he wants to say no. Largely the way things work in an Islamist authoritarian system like the Islamic Republic is they'll have the broad contours of a policy set, and then different agencies, structures, bureaucracies will go about carrying them out essentially as they deem fit. So right now we're in the world of the Islamic Republic is trying to respond or thinking through how to respond militarily to Israel, to the killing of Ismail Haniyeh. There's talk about revenge and bloodlust, but there are also internally, institutionally, and particularly with the most important element for your question, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, trying to think through how to borrow an academic phrase, face off, but not also lose face, to also save face as they face off against the Israelis and potentially this larger integrated air and missile defense architecture in the region. So again, long story short, there's a whole host of institutions that basically are co-opted by pro-Khamenei loyalists, if one cares about STEM charts and bureaucracy and the essentially non-existent rule of law in that country. But then the X factor there is, of course, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps and the veterans from the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps and the veterans from the Iran-Iraq War who have essentially left the battlefield and are now in business and are now in politics and are now in, you could say, key hybrid political national security posts. So they are keeping the ship on this course because they are essentially implementers of those broad edicts that come on down from the top.
Could you elaborate a bit further on how these internal dynamics you've described may shape Iran's response to the assassination of Ismail Haniyeh in Tehran last month? And why do you believe it has taken so long for a response to occur?
Let's start with the latter because I'm actually working on that right now. And I'm not sure when this is going to come out, but this is hopefully still topical and timely because the Iranian press has been reporting in spades about the trip of Amos Hochstein, the U.S. Special Envoy, to Lebanon. The U.S. was reportedly supposed to send Antony Blinken to Israel, but that trip was canceled. Allegedly on Thursday, there will be hostage talks, even without the Hamas representatives, still in Qatar by the Qataris and the Egyptians and whatever kind of diplomatic negotiating team the U.S. had sent there. Why all of this matters is that I think Iran understands itself to be, despite all of the rhetoric and the hyperbole and the invective against Israel, and really the word that was repeated across multiple hardline newspapers in the first week of the killing of Ismail Haniyeh was a word that Khamenei used in his speech, which was bloodlust. And that was really the theme. So they are really still looking to respond kinetically or militarily, I should say. So I still think it's a matter of when and not if they will respond. But they're trying to find a way to do this that sets a baseline from the April 13 attack, but that also helps them win political points. This is about restoring deterrence as well, without also invoking a larger military response by the Israelis. You know, in the last military exchange, which was, let's not be shy about this, this was a historic first. In the 45-year shadow war of the Islamic Republic against Israel, everything had been essentially from proxy or from forward deployed territory, launching ballistic missiles overtly, directly from Iranian territory to Israel. This is a game changer. And as the Islamic Republic moves to embrace hybrid warfare, moving from asymmetric to hybrid, well, hybrid requires the employment of something other than asymmetric, which are conventional. And as Iran moves into that space, it's A, a measure of its own confidence, B, a measure that it can survive whatever is thrown back at it, but C, also an indication of how advanced and changed its long-range strike capabilities are. But at the same time, because the Israelis couldn't claim their April 19th military response against the Iranians really felt like they won that round, even though the Israelis were able to expose a much softer underbelly through a much more limited strike that actually did much more damage. And the Iranians are still looking to find a way to win something politically. Again, the embarrassment of the Haniyeh strike cannot be minimized for them. It reminded me of a line from a former intelligence minister in Iran who said that, I'm paraphrasing, but no Islamic Republic official should be sleeping safely at night. And he was alluding to the level of Mossad penetration and other potential foreign intelligence service penetration of the Islamic Republic security state. I think he said this in 2021, but it was a much older intel minister. So in this regard, the regime is trying to score political points. That's why the more time they're taking, it tells me the more time that they're trying to coordinate. But B, also the more time they're trying to take advantage of what's going on with the U.S. and the region, with the increased force presence, with the increased diplomatic overtures, and to try to see, there was a Reuters story. I don't know if this is exactly what those security elements that we were talking about want. I think they still want to strike, but they're trying to see if the Americans might offer them, I think, a diplomatic face-saving ramp. One wonders if there is a ceasefire that America foists onto Israel, would the Islamic Republic take credit for that and say, I dangled my missiles and America, shackled its partner in the region, something to that effect. I think that is entirely within the realm of possibility. But I think the more likely answer is the Occam's razor. Simplest is the most likely. They're coordinating. This is a tough mission. The April 13, April 19 exchange showed that, the Israelis have the technical wherewithal. Now the Israelis want to likely claim a strike if the Iranians strike back. There's more American military hardware in the region. There's 2 carrier strike groups. There's a nuclear-powered submarine. There's all of this stuff. So the Islamic Republic is likely, in my view, still logistically and politically calculating. But make no mistake, I think they're enjoying this drawn-out debate over punishment and revenge. I was just looking at the Iranian press this morning before we sat down. There is a semi-official outlet tied to the IRGC that is essentially brandishing the longer the wait time goes on, the more fear the Israelis will have. And I think they're trying to weaponize this fear. And even Iranian proxies have been intent about weaponizing this fear. So you put all of this together, the logistical challenges, the political challenges, the desire to restore deterrence, the desire to potentially find an American off-ramp, and now, obviously, the weaponized fear or the politicized fear, the distributed punishment over time, which is not that odd because in the last go-round, it took about 12 days for the Iranians to launch missiles. When Qasem Soleimani was killed in January 2020, it took about 5 days for them to launch missiles. So the timeline clearly is being added to here. But I think it's much more of a mosaic than one single answer.
Thanks for joining us today, Mr. Ben Taleblu. Now we'll turn to Dr. Juneau. Could you give an initial assessment of new Iranian President Masoud Pezeshkian? What direction does he intend to take Iran's defense and foreign policies in?
Masoud Pezeshkian was elected as president just a few weeks ago. He is widely identified as a reformist. It is always important when talking about labels like that, reformists, hardliners, and so on, to understand what it means in the Iranian context. Sometimes you have people who will say that it's completely meaningless because they're all part of a system that is heavily dictatorial and repressive. Others will tend at the other extreme to exaggerate what these labels can mean. And I think there's probably a truth somewhere in the middle, which is, as a reformist, he is a loyal member of the system. He does not want to change or to overthrow the Islamic Republic. He is not committed to democratic values and the rule of law. He is loyal to the supreme leader, who is the real boss in the system. At the same time, he does want to tinker with the system. He does want to tactically change it. He does want to open up a bit on social issues in particular. He also wants the Islamic Republic to present a less hostile or less confrontational face to the world, especially to its neighbors. He has been open to relaunching nuclear negotiations with the U.S. These are tactical differences with hardliners. These are not strategic differences. So do these differences matter? Yes, they do, but we shouldn't exaggerate them.
In terms of his desire to, as you said, slightly open relations with the West, warm a bit, what actors in Iran's domestic, political, and military landscape seek to limit his capacity to do so, and how so?
So that's the key question. Mr. Pezeshkian, the new president, may want these things, i.e. some opening and loosening on the social policy side, some opening on in terms of a less confrontational or harsh foreign policy in terms of both rhetoric and substance. The problem is that he's not the boss. The president in Iran is not the most powerful individual. That is the supreme leader, who is not elected and who holds the position for life, Ali Khamenei. Khamenei is on this spectrum much more on the conservative and hardliner side, and he is not very much open to the changes, however limited a reformist like Mr. Pezeshkian is suggesting. In implementing that more hardline view in general on the social policy side domestically, but also on the foreign policy side, the supreme leader is primarily aligned with the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the IRGC, that we talk about so much. The IRGC is, especially in terms of its leadership, very much aligned with this hardliner view that the supreme leader holds. So they are not especially keen, and by they I mean the IRGC and the supreme leader, and a lot of their allies in this very complicated machine that is the system that is the Islamic Republic. They are not especially keen on the somewhat loosening on the social policy side, but also on the foreign policy side that the president is proposing. And this matters because they are the ones who hold the levers of power. And they are the ones, in the case of the Supreme Leader, who holds ultimate decision-making authority and not the president.
How are these factions that you've mentioned that are aligned closely with the Supreme Leader shaping the response to the assassination of Ismail Haniyeh in Tehran last month? Can you elaborate on how they differ in response to how and why Iran's response should occur?
So everything I've said so far in terms of how the system works in Iran is things that we know based on years of observation of the Islamic Republic. The problem with answering your question, it's a very good question, but it's based on you're focusing on very current events. This is a system that is very opaque, that is where debates on these issues are not transparent on a day-to-day basis. So we can try to speculate on where these different factions position themselves on how and when and to what extent should Iran retaliate against Israel. But we don't really know. I mean, there's been a few media reports that the president, Mr. Pezeshkian, has been advocating for a much more measured response after the assassination of Haniyeh, the political leader of Hamas, in Tehran a couple of weeks ago. Whether that's true or not, I'm not even sure, right? I mean, there's been media reports, but we don't even know for sure. It's plausible that reformist factions would be advocating inside the system for a somewhat more measured response, not for no response, but for a somewhat more measured response. It's plausible, but we don't know for sure. Apparently, again, according to some media reports, the IRGC seems to be advocating for a harsher response. But irrespective of these tactical views of different factions, the one big factor that is causing some hesitation in Iran right now in terms of its retaliation is not so much the reformist versus hardliner spectrum and everybody in between. It's the reality that in conventional military terms, Iran is really not as powerful as Israel and the US are. When Israel and Iran are confronting each other indirectly, when Iran supports terrorist groups or militias or non-state actors like Hezbollah, like the Houthis and others to attack Israel, that's one thing. And Iran can cause a fair bit of regional damage doing that. When we're talking, as we are now, as we speak, about the serious possibility of escalation to full-blown war between Israel and Iran, that's a different ballgame. It's a different dynamic. In that scenario of full-blown war, everybody suffers. Civilian populations suffer, both sides suffer, all sides suffer. I don't think there's only two sides. Iran suffers more than others because Israel and the US are way more powerful than Iran is. And that is what is causing Iran right now to hesitate, because it wants to find this sweet spot where it retaliates. It sends a message of strength because Iran perceives that it cannot not retaliate, because in its view, that would send a message of weakness. At the same time, Iran really wants to make sure that its retaliation doesn't lead to full-blown escalation.
If you can speculate on the wider scope of current events, how do you anticipate the current crisis in the Middle East affecting regional stability in the long term? Is a regional war still off limits?
So these are really, really difficult questions. I've been saying since October 7th, 2023, that a regional war was not likely. I've been cautiously optimistic. And it's hard to use the word optimism in talking about what's going on right now. But I would say, very moderately confident in saying that there wouldn't be full-blown war, because I am convinced that Iran and Hezbollah don't want that war because they would lose, basically. And that goes for Iran, as I just said. It goes for Hezbollah, too. Israel has said, and I think they mean it, that in the event of a war with Hezbollah, they would annihilate Lebanon and push it towards absolute societal collapse that would take years or decades to get out of. And Hezbollah doesn't want that. Today, in mid-August, I'm still very, very cautiously predicting that there won't be all-out war, but I am not as confident as I was until, for months after October, because tensions are so high, and because a spark could be the catalyst for a miscalculation leading to an all-out war that different sides may not want, but it could still happen, right? That happens. Speaking in the long term, in terms of the repercussions, as you asked, we could go on forever about that. But there's just one thing that I'll say here to try to be brief, is that whatever happens, even if all-out war is avoided, and the dynamics that I explained are the ones that end up on top in terms of explaining what is happening, things are not going to be the same. And the baseline of tension between Israel and Iran will have increased by another notch. Right, that baseline has already increased a lot in the last few months, go back to April, just a few months ago, when Iran launched 300 drones and missiles on Israel. That is a massive precedent. It is something that had not happened before, direct Iranian attack on Israel. That's a precedent, right? The rules of the game, the implicit understanding between Iran and Israel, Hezbollah and Israel, as to what are the red lines that are not to be crossed, have really changed in the last few months. And so this baseline of tension between the two sides is much higher than it is before. And I do not see conditions where it goes back to where we were on October 6th of 2023, which already was not a fun level.
Aside from, as you've described, Iran and Hezbollah's sort of self-imposed limitations, what regional or other external international pressures do you see as limiting the scope of Iran's retaliation?
There's several of them. So to try to go quickly on the key ones, Iran's relations with a lot of its neighbors have improved in the last couple of years, in particular with Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia and Iran remain rivals. They are not friends. They are not at peace. But their relations have improved in the last couple of years, and I would say to some extent at Saudi initiative. And there's been an understanding between the two sides to do a much better job at managing their tensions, not resolving them. And that's been good for Iran, and it's been good for Saudi Arabia. Iran realizes that an escalation that gets out of control in the next hours, maybe, or the next days, weeks, could damage that progress that Iran has done with Saudi Arabia, but with others in the region too. Is Iran going to forego retaliation against Israel to protect these gains? No, I don't think it's strong enough, but it's factoring in that dimension. I would also add U.S. pressure. Iran has always been somewhat willing to play chicken with the U.S., believing that Iran could provoke and do more and do more and do a bit more every time, right? Sometimes in Iranian studies, we call that the salami tactics of doing just a bit more every time, believing that the U.S. would not retaliate. So far, that's not been a bad calculus on Iran's side. But now, the U.S. has been sending fairly strong messages to Iran to be careful with its retaliation. Does Iran really call the U.S.'s bluff? I don't think so fully seriously, but it might be having some impact because, again, Iran knows that if there is escalation to all-out war, the U.S. would jump in with Israel. The U.S. will not sit on the sidelines, and Iran knows this. And that the U.S., again, because of its conventional military firepower, has the ability to do serious damage to Iran. And ultimately, I do think that Iran wants to avoid that. So, again, the whole calculus on Iran's part is to try to calibrate to do as much retaliation as possible while avoiding large-scale retaliation to its own retaliation.
How might these current tensions between Iran and Israel impact the Red Sea crisis, and how might it change Iran's use of Houthis and other proxy groups to further their interests in the region?
So I'm happy you asked that question because my main focus in the last few months has been specifically on the Red Sea, right? Over the years, I've studied a lot the relationship between Iran and the Houthis in Yemen. I just finished another article, a long academic article on how to contain and try to defeat the Houthis. That should be out in the fall, so I'll be sure to point it out when it comes out. It's an additional layer that makes the situation more volatile and more difficult for Israel. If or when, more likely, Iran and Hezbollah launch a retaliation against Israel, that could be, between the time you and I speak now and the time this is put online. It could be right after it's put online. It could be in 2 weeks. We just don't know. I have no doubt that the Houthis will also be attacking Israel to open up a new front to Israel's south, which increases the odds of Israel's air defenses being overwhelmed. And that's a significant danger for Israel. And in Israel, they are very, very conscious of this and working hard to try to protect against it. The one thing that is different in the case of the Houthis compared to Hezbollah is that the Houthis are 2,000 kilometers away from Israel, right? And it sounds obvious to say that, but when you unpack the implications of that, it does change the dynamics. The Houthis can lob missiles and drones on Israel. That can cause tactical damage to Israel. But it's not the same thing as what the Hezbollah can do to Israel because they share a border. Hezbollah has maybe 150,000 rockets. The Houthis have a very large stockpile, but again, they're 2,000 kilometers away. So the Houthis will milk this for propaganda gains, which they have done, I have to admit, quite effectively in the last few months. But their ability to be a game changer in terms of the military dynamics of this conflict are themselves more limited. Completely separate discussion, which I won't open up more here, but it's just to say that in parallel to that, the Houthi threat to shipping in the Red Sea, which is a major problem for the U.S., but for everybody else, not just for the U.S., is a threat that has really been opened up by the what's been going on in Gaza. But it is a threat that will stay with us far beyond what happens in Gaza. I hope there's a ceasefire in Gaza sooner rather than later. But if or when there's a ceasefire in Gaza, the Houthi threat to shipping in the Red Sea will continue. It will not stop. And nobody should be naive in believing that.
Iranian technology directly enables drone attacks by the Houthis and other proxies across the Middle East. How do Canada and other Western allies need to adapt their strategy to support regional partners in combating this issue?
So great question. A lot of the missiles and drones that the Houthis and Hezbollah and others have been using come either entirely or in part from Iranian support. So it's at the core of everything that we're talking about right now. Iran directly transfers parts for missiles and drones, but Iran also transfers know-how, and that makes it a lot more difficult. The Houthis actually manufacture a lot of their own drones and missiles now, thanks to know-how from Iran and thanks to only the most technologically advanced parts, which are not available inside Yemen, very poor, torn by violence and so on. They get those more advanced parts from Iran, but the bulk, the bigger parts, they do it themselves. That makes it more difficult. So what can Canada and, to be fair, the U.S. primarily and other allies do? Transfer technology for air defenses and counter-drone technology, various counter-drone technologies to Saudi Arabia, to Israel, and to other regional partners. The U.S. does that already. It should do it more. More maritime interdiction efforts to counter those Iranian transfers of technology, those various advanced parts to the Houthis and to others. Easy to say and hard to do. But there's scope for doing more. More sanctions and actually enforcing sanctions on these issues. And in the case of Yemen, supporting anti-Houthi forces. The Houthis have been able to do a lot of what they do in Yemen, in the Red Sea and beyond, because their adversaries in Yemen, i.e. the internationally recognized government, their adversaries are so weak, corrupt, fragmented, and frankly incompetent. And that is a direct criticism on them, but also on their external backers, especially Saudi Arabia, but also the U.S. Is it too late? In many ways it is. But if we want to have a serious long-term strategy to counter Houthi attacks in the Red Sea, it needs to involve building up anti-Houthi forces in Yemen.
Thanks for joining us today, Dr. Juneau. Now we'll turn to Dr. Jones. Could you begin by giving brief thoughts on the escalations in the Middle East this past weekend, including Hezbollah's airstrike on the Majid al-Sham soccer field in Israel's Golan Heights, as well as the retaliatory assassinations by Israel in Lebanon and Iran?
Yeah, I mean, it represents a deterioration of the situation, obviously. Hezbollah has claimed that it did not intend to strike this soccer field, that it was an accident. Some elements of Hezbollah are still refusing to admit that they were responsible at all. And I think that that's probably true. They've shown a reluctance to strike civilian targets up to this point. They're not reluctant generally, but up to this point in this particular conflict, they don't want it to escalate. So I think that it may well have been, as they say, an accident, but Israel felt it had to respond. I think that there's a sense in many parts of the region that Israel's response sort of increased the tension, in the sense that I don't think Hezbollah was expecting one of its senior officials on the outskirts of Beirut to be targeted. I think they were expecting more strikes in the southern part of Lebanon against Hezbollah military targets. And certainly the attack on the Hamas leadership in Iran was a surprise to everybody. And so I think that there's a sense that the situation has escalated, but I don't think any of the sides involved in this, whether it's Iran or Israel or Hezbollah or Hamas, even really wants this to degenerate into a full-scale regional war. So I think there's still hope to bring it back from the edge.
Let's shift now to talk a bit more about the domestic politics of Israel and how it interplays with all of this. Could you elaborate a bit on what the pressures are on Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu and how they affect his handling of the conflict?
Yeah, I mean, he's under enormous pressure, and from a variety of different sources and in a variety of different directions. The push and pull is enormous. Politically, he depends for his survival on some extremely right-wing parties, some small parties, but they play a large role in his coalition in the Israeli parliament. He is under significant pressure when it comes to things like a ceasefire and so on, because they've said that they'll pull out of the coalition if he signs a ceasefire agreement, if Netanyahu signs a ceasefire agreement, and that would end his government. So that's one set of pressures. And then the other side, there are sort of the families of the hostages, and I think more generally a large part of Israeli society, which blames Netanyahu for the attack of October the 7th, or at least for Israel not being prepared. I mean, Hamas is responsible, obviously, and which clearly wants him to prioritize bringing the hostages on, which means effectively reaching a ceasefire. And so he's got this really contradictory pressure. So far, he's tended to side with his own political survival, with the extreme right-wing members of his coalition. And I think he'll probably continue to do that for a long time. His political survival is paramount in his view. But then beyond that, there are pressures on him, obviously, from the United States and the West more generally, in terms of their views of the deterioration of the Middle East and the impact that this conflict is having on their interests in terms of trying to promote a higher degree of stability in the Middle East. There are pressures on him from Arab countries. There are some Arab countries that have signed peace with Israel, but perhaps illegally, more importantly, there are Arab countries who were in the process of developing relations with Israel, primarily Saudi Arabia. And they've made it very clear that they won't go any further on that until this conflict comes to an end and some sort of Israeli-Palestinian peace process begins again. But once again, we then turn back to the problem that he has domestically of this will end his coalition. And so he's really stuck between a rock and a hard place. And I think to some extent, the strike he made against, for example, the Hamas leader in Tehran was a way of trying to buy some time and trying to, in a way, avoid succumbing to the pressure for a ceasefire, because it's obviously removed that. I mean, Hamas now will not talk about a ceasefire for at least a little while anyway. And so I think he's really dancing on the edge of a knife, and he's trying to find his way forward.
I was wondering if you could talk a bit about the longer-term implications of Iran's use of non-state actor groups for the regions.
Well, it's been going on for a very long time. It's not new at all. I mean, it's stepped up a level now in the last few years. But, I mean, Iran has traditionally, first of all, regarded itself as the protector of the Shiite minorities throughout the region. And so it's always played a role in terms of assisting the Shiite minorities in various countries in Lebanon and Syria and elsewhere in the region. But beyond that, I mean, Iran has seen these organizations as essentially proxies that it can use to turn up the heat, to attack enemies in a way which is sort of not direct and can't be necessarily directly traced back to Iran, although that's obviously no longer, I mean, everybody knows it's Iran now, and so that's no longer as viable an argument as it once was. I think that where we are now is that when all the dust settles in all this, if it indeed it settles anytime soon, I mean, the Iranians are going to have some thinking to do about how useful these proxies are, because to some extent they've taken Iran into places where it's in danger of getting into wars it might not want to be in. And therefore, when you give proxies support and aid, if they go off and do things on their own, or at least go further than you'd like them to, you get dragged along with them. And I think to some extent, Israel is trying to send that signal that we no longer are going to accept that when the Houthis strike us from Yemen, it's not Iran. It is Iran. And I think that also the West, the US and Europe, has said that game is over. When these groups strike Israel or do other things to foment trouble in the region, the address is Tehran, and we refuse to accept any idea that it isn't. So it's a balance. I mean, I think that with respect to Hezbollah, Iran will continue to support Hezbollah and continue to be very much engaged in making sure that Hezbollah is a formidable military force, because that is a direct interest of Iran's in terms of Iranian deterrence against an Israeli strike on Iran. In terms of the other groups, I mean, I think we'll see, how the dust settles when this is all over with. I would expect that there are at least some people in Tehran who are wondering how useful all this has been. Other actors in the region who've always been deeply suspicious of Iran's involvement with these non-state actors are not going to tolerate it anymore, and it contributes to the desire of many countries in the region, led by Saudi Arabia, but not just Saudi Arabia, to find ways to work with Israel and with the U.S. and others to deter Iran and to deter this kind of activity. So to some extent, it's from Iran's point of view, it's sort of self-defeating. And that, I think, again, is one of the reasons why there'll probably be a bit of a rethink in Tehran about how much we want to get involved with some of these small groups going forward. And that's not to say everybody in Iran will feel that way. There are a lot of people who are extremists, and they view the situation as an existential battle on religious terms and so on. And they will argue for continuing to be involved with these groups. But I think calmer heads will say we need to start thinking about whether our involvement with some of these groups is really in our interest.
What at this point is preventing the outbreak of a full-scale Israel-Hezbollah war? And what would the warning signs be that these deterrence factors are no longer enough and that escalation into a full-scale regional war is going to occur?
I mean, I think the main thing that's preventing it is that nobody wants it. For a variety of reasons, neither side wants to go there. And as I said a little while ago, the danger is that they'll stumble into it. I mean, there'll be a missile strike on one side or the other that will go wrong and will attack civilians, and one side will feel like that's just violent. And it just kind of, to some extent, that's exactly what's happening now, although I don't necessarily think it's sort of decisively going to lead to a wider regional war at this point in time. And I think that, after the sort of dust settles on these two assassinations that have gone on in Beirut and Tehran, a lot of Israelis are going to sit back and say, well, okay, that's nice that we did that, but the hostages are still in Gaza. The war's still going on. Nothing's really changed. We may feel a bit better. We may have proven to Israel and Hezbollah and to ourselves that we can do this. And that's nice, but what's changed, And so I think that a sort of people will sit back and take a breath, I hope, and say, okay, fine, but where has that got us? And there's still the calculation that this is not worth a wider regional war, which is the firm calculation in Israel and in the Washington and in Tehran and even in Hezbollah is still going to be there. And so I think that as long as that's the case, there's hope that this won't go all the way. But I mean, obviously, what happened over the weekend is not, it raises the prospect that we'll stumble into something. And so I hope that in the retaliation which is coming inevitably from both Iran and Hezbollah, there will be some quiet messages sent that we'll go this far and no further. There is a feeling, certainly the leader of Hezbollah has said it openly, that that Israel crossed some red lines and went further than we'd expected it to. I think this is really about the attack in the suburbs of Beirut on a senior Hezbollah figure. That wasn't expected. And so there will be some feeling that there's a need to retaliate in a way that seems to, quote unquote, go beyond the red lines. But if it's signaled in advance quietly what it's going to be, and everybody kind of agrees this far and no further, it could still be pulled back from the brink.
Thank you again for taking the time to appear on the CDA Institute's Expert Series podcast, and we hope to have you on again soon. That's all for today's episode of the CDA Institute's Expert Series. To learn more about the CDA Institute, you can visit our website at www.cdainstitute.ca or subscribe to our newsletter. Thank you, and we hope you'll be tuning in next time.